And over to you, Nora. You're muted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to start the presentation. So today I will present this study that we have been conducting on the topic of misophonia. So the study is called Profiling Misophonia from Heightened Sensory Sensitivity to Intolerance of Sounds. And okay. So the aims of the presentation today, so I'm going to introduce misophonia and the hypothesis of our first online study, and then present the latest findings of the study and discuss the next research questions that we are now kind of discussing for the next study and future research ideas. So misophonia is basically an aversion to specific sounds that negatively impacts a person's life. So common trigger sounds are human-made. So for example, chewing and breathing, or repetitive sounds such as clock ticking or tapping fingers, but they also can be more idiosyncratic, such as bass from speakers. So people who experience misophonia typically have the reactions of anger or disgust or anxiety and pain when they're faced with these sounds. And they typically adjust their lives in order to avoid trigger sounds. But it's usually the case that there are specific trigger sounds rather than all sounds that they find particularly problematic. And this condition affects social relationships and also the work life of individuals who have misophonia. And so the hypothesis of this project is that there might be some broad low-level individual differences in sensory sensitivity that may work together with other traits, which together essentially might result in misophonia emerging as a condition. So it could be that people with misophonia have more sensory sensitivity in general, not limited to audition, but then when they hear sort of specific trigger sounds, specifically, for example, human-made sounds, they might interpret their kind of sensory responses in a particular way, and then basically they might assign higher to these particular sounds, which would make them harder to ignore. And this is kind of in line with other contemporary approaches to clinical problems where disorders can be thought of as emerging from simpler interacting elements or sort of like different kind of traits and tendencies working together to create the disorder. So, for example, if we consider modeling the symptoms as a sort of network, then there could be various tendencies that essentially are related to each other, but there might be a particular tendency that kind of be like the central trait that might give rise to a particular condition. So about the online study, so the method of the study, so the hypothesis and the methods analysis were pre-registered, and this was a multi-part online study. So there was the first part, which was like a screener survey, and this was carried out via the Misophonia Hub webpage, which basically invited people who self-refer as experiencing misophonia to kind of take part in a sort of like a preliminary survey, which focuses on various aspects about their hearing and about their experience with misophonia. And so quite a lot of misophonic participants took part in this initial survey, about more than 1,000 essentially, but there are also some non-misophonic control participants that we specifically invited to take part via SONA or via, and also via other testing platforms. But we specifically selected people who do not experience misophonia to take part further in our studies as well for the controls. So for the second part, this was the longer part of the study. And for this part, we only introduced, and we only invited specific participants. So we invite half of the participants were control participants who do not experience misophonia, and half of the participants were misophonic. And we administered 3 types of measures. So initially we administered a detailed assessment of misophonia and hearing. And then we had a set of measures relating to clinical characteristics. And then we had measures relating to sensory sensitivity. And I'll explain these a bit later. So first of all, we had the Sussex Misophonia Scale, which was developed in the lab. And it basically asks people to rate their experiences with misophonia. And there are 5 factors to this questionnaire relating to such aspects as life consequences because of misophonia or pain experience because of misophonia. And it essentially asks questions like, for example, I feel no one really understands that I have a problem with sounds. So it's all, the questionnaire is all how misophonia influences a person's life. And so we conducted cluster analysis on the 5 factors of the Sussex Misophonia Scale. So these factors are feelings, isolation, life consequences, intersocial reactivity, avoidance, repulsion, and pain. And we carried this out on the large sample of the screener survey to identify subgroups of misophonia. So this screener survey sample consisted of both self-referred misophonics and control participants. And then we basically compared these 3 groups that we found via cluster analysis on the various measures that we had, and we confirmed that these groups seem to correspond to control participants who would not be categorized as misophonic based on the SMS threshold. Then there were participants who experienced moderate misophonia, which were a mixture of participants who would be considered misophonic, but also participants perhaps who experienced some of these kind of like life consequences because of misophonia, but they would not be over the threshold. And then there were severe misophonics who all of them were over the SMS threshold. And so we conducted our analysis based on comparing controls to misophonics as a group, and also based on comparing these 3 subgroups, so people with moderate and severe misophonia and controls. Also in the Sussex Misophonia Scale, there were questions on sound triggers. So for example, there were 8 categories of sounds that typically, some of them are typically misophonic triggers, and people responded whether they generally hate that sound category. So for example, I hate the sound of people eating, and then they were asked to pick out which specific sound triggers they hated hearing. So for example, chewing or lip smacking or swallowing. And then the sound trigger data was analyzed to see how the sound triggers grouped together and how the 2 misophonic groups, moderate and severe, differ from the controls in terms of the frequency of reporting a sound as a trigger. And so here you can see the various sound triggers from the Sussex Misophonia Scale. And so for example, refrigerator humming, dishwasher, washing machine, dryer. And then there's the 3 groups that we identified: the control participants, the moderate misophonics, and the severe misophonics. And basically, the the triggers grouped together such that, for example, here you can see eating sounds specifically, such as crunchy foods, crispy snacks, lip smacking. Then there are some breathing and throat sounds, as well as some nasal sounds. So, and then also you can see here more repetitive sounds, such as typing on computer, foot on floor, tapping finger, pen clicking. And so the three groups, as you can see, the controls, they might still report some of these sounds, especially perhaps the eating related sounds as a trigger or as a sound that they hate. But the two groups of moderate and severe misophonics, they're much higher on reporting these particular sounds as triggers. So if you were to kind of like identify misophonia, then I think this is quite a good graph for sort of assessing what misophonia is. So it's mostly hating these sort of human-made eating and nasal sounds, as well as more kind of like repetitive actions that people carry out. So in addition to Sussex Misophonia Scale, we then also assessed various clinical and affective traits. So this was based on confirmatory hypothesis based on some previous literature on misophonia. So we assessed anxiety sensitivity index. We assessed autistic traits. We assessed obsessive compulsive traits, and also the experience of migraines and headaches. And then we also assessed sensory sensitivity. So we measured general self-reported sensory sensitivity with the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire. And we also measured interoceptive awareness, as interoceptive awareness can be considered basically as sensitivity to your internal body signals. And then we also measured sensitivity in visual and auditory tests. So there was a visual sensitivity task, or the pattern glare task, which assessed reactions to visual stimuli on various descriptors. And then there was an auditory sensitivity task, which assessed reactions to sounds on various descriptors. And I'll talk about these two tasks in a bit more detail. So this is the auditory sensory sensitivity task. So here, essentially, the participant hears a sound clip for 15 seconds, and then is asked to rate their reaction to the sound on various descriptors. Most of these are negative and would be related to the misophonic response, but some of them are more neutral or even positive. So they would be asked to rate their reaction on a scale from 0 to 100, and they would be also, they can replay the sound if needed. And we had 32 sounds. We had 8 sounds and 4 categories so 8 sounds per category. So we had human oral nasal sounds, which would typically be misophonic triggers. Then we had other human-made sounds, non-human sounds, and then we had some scrambled sounds, which were basically non-recognizable scrambled versions of the human-made sounds. And yeah, there are 17 descriptors overall. So then in the visual pattern glare task, participants saw gratings of different spatial frequencies. So low spatial frequency, medium spatial frequency, and this would be the example of high spatial frequency. And again, they would be asked to rate their reactions to these visual stimuli in terms of, so sometimes people experience when looking at these kinds of stimuli, faint lines or shadowy shapes or blur. And this would essentially be a measure of visual sensitivity. So our hypotheses were as follows. So we hypothesized that misophonics will have increased clinical traits in the domain of anxiety, autism spectrum, obsessive compulsive tendencies, and also increased headaches and migraines. And we also hypothesized that misophonics will have heightened sensory sensitivity, and that this would be heightened outside of their set of triggers, so across the modalities. And we also hypothesized that people with misophonia would have more interoceptive sensibility, or more greater interoceptive awareness about their body signals, but a lower ability to self-regulate internal states. And then we had some exploratory analyses which were pre-registered, but these were more based on exploring the different subtypes of misophonia obtained by the cluster analysis, and looking at whether different subtypes of misophonia essentially have different profile of clinical and sensory sensitivity traits. And then we also wanted to create a symptom network profile of misophonia that looks at the relationship between the different symptoms and traits. And finally, we intended to do phenomenological cartography, which is basically in the auditory sensitivity task, looking at how the different sounds and the different responses made to these sounds can discriminate people with misophonia from people who do not have misophonia. So first of all, in terms of the clinical traits, we did indeed find, when comparing misophonics with controls, that misophonics have significantly greater autism spectrum traits, obsessive compulsive tendencies, and anxiety sensitivity. So anxiety sensitivity actually was marginally significant. But then we looked at the subgroups of participants. So we have the controls, people with moderate misophonia and people with severe misophonia. And so here we found that there are significant differences between the three groups, and specifically on the most of the subscales of the AQ, such as social skill, attention to detail, and communication. There were differences between the groups. There weren't any differences in attention switching or imagination. And mostly these differences were driven by the more severe group, but the moderate misophonics also had greater attention to detail than controls. We also found that misophonics have significantly greater obsessive compulsive tendencies. So here the three groups also differed on the majority of the obsessive compulsive subscales, such as washing, checking, obsessing, ordering, and doubting. But here they were all driven by the more severe group. And then here the groups also differed in terms of anxiety sensitivity. And again, the differences were driven by the severe misophonic group. So they had more physical concerns, cognitive concerns, and social concerns in terms of anxiety. And finally, we also found that misophonics report significantly more migraines. So this questionnaire that we had, it basically categorized people in terms of whether they're headache-free, whether they have mild non-migrainous headaches, headaches not otherwise specified, migraines without aura, and migraines with aura. And here what we found that basically individuals with severe misophonia tend to have more migraines with aura, and these specifically migraines with visual aura. So then in terms of the second hypothesis, we hypothesized that individuals with misophonia would have more sensory sensitivity. And in terms of self-reported sensory sensitivity, this is what we found. So they reported greater sensory hypersensitivity, but not hyposensitivity. So this Glasgow sensory questionnaire basically has two kind of aspects of sensory sensitivity. One is hypersensitivity, or just being more sensitive to visual stimuli. And then there's hyposensitivity, which is actually the opposite, sort of not noticing, for example, when you're cold, and these kinds of things. But yeah, so misophonics as a group compared to controls were higher on the hypersensitivity measure. And then when looking at hypersensitivity across the modalities, again, it looks like the three groups were significantly different in terms of hypersensitivity. And this was the case across all modalities, so visual, auditory, gustatory, olfactory, tactile, vestibular, proprioceptive. However, here, actually, the moderate misophonic group was also different from controls in terms of hypersensitivity. So finally, when we looked at visual sensitivity in terms of the task, so here we found that misophonics report greater sensitivity to visual gratings. However, the difference seems to be driven by the severe rather than moderate misophonics. So here, generally, misophonics reported kind of like more of these reactions to visual gratings, but this was specifically so for the high spatial frequency gratings when comparing the two groups. But when comparing the three groups, it seems that moderate misophonics were actually similar to controls in terms of their reactions to these gratings, and that it was the severe misophonics that had the more intense reactions to these visual stimuli. So then we looked at auditory sensitivity in terms of the task measure. So here, where individuals needed to listen to sounds and rate them on various descriptors. So we later analyzed all of the descriptors, but for this comparison, we focused specifically on the discomfort descriptor. And here we found that misophonics actually report more discomfort than controls in terms of the human-made sounds specifically, but they do not differ from the controls in terms of the non-human sounds and the scrambled sounds. So again, it seems that even though misophonics tend to have this broad level sensory sensitivity, it's the human-made sounds specifically that are problematic or discomforting. And then in terms of the interoception, we found that actually misophonics do not differ from controls in terms of their interoceptive sensibility. And when this was broken down in terms of awareness of body signals and self-regulation, they did not really differ. So conclusions so far, based on these analyses, it seems that misophonia is associated with general sensory hypersensitivity that is expressed across the modalities or goes beyond audition. However, human-made sounds specifically seem to be most discomforting for misophonics. Misophonia also occurs with autism spectrum traits and clinical symptoms of anxiety and obsessive compulsive tendencies. Interoception is overall not affected in misophonia, neither in terms of sensitivity nor self-regulation. So then I showed some of these results already, but these next graphs will kind of basically look at the differences between the subgroups of the participants in more detail. So this is when we performed the cluster analysis and we divided participants in terms of controls, moderate misophonics and severe misophonics. So we did find that the three groups differ significantly on most of the questionnaire measures and their subscales, such as the AQ, the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire, the Anxiety Sensitivity, the Obsessive Compulsive Questionnaire, but not on interoception. However, it seems that for the majority of these, the difference is actually driven by the severe group rather than the moderate misophonics. So here, this is another way to visualize basically the differences between controls, moderate misophonics and severe misophonics in terms of the effect size comparison between controls, moderate misophonics and severe misophonics. And so it seems that for the different total scores of the questionnaires, when moderate misophonics are compared to controls in terms of effect size, they're quite similar. But for the severe misophonics, they tend to really stand out in terms of most of the clinical and sensory questionnaires. So the obsessive compulsive questionnaire, the autism spectrum questionnaire, the sensory sensitivity questionnaire, and the anxiety questionnaire, but not the interoception questionnaire. And so this is again comparing the three groups, controls, moderate misophonics, and severe misophonics, but this time only comparing them on Glasgow sensory questionnaire subscales. So there's hypersensitivity in the different modalities, so visual, auditory, and so on. And here there's hyposensitivity or lack of sensitivity in the different subscales. And here, again, this is a comparison in terms of the effect size. So if these are controls, you can see that moderate misophonics actually do stand out from the controls in terms of auditory hypersensitivity, olfactory hypersensitivity, tactile. However, for severe misophonics, this kind of pattern is more pronounced. So for severe misophonics, they tend to stand out from controls in terms of most of these hypersensitivities. But as you can see, neither group really differs that much from controls in terms of the hyposensitivity. So it seems that both of these groups are more hypersensitive. It's just that the severe group is most hypersensitive. And here, there's all of the questionnaires visualized and how the two groups of misophonics differ from controls in terms of effect size. So basically, as you can see, these three are the ones where the severe group really differs from controls. The two groups don't really differ that much on Maya, the interoception questionnaire. But again, the pattern is kind of similar, but it's just that the severe misophonic group is kind of differs more from controls than the moderate group. So conclusions so far are that severe misophonics scored higher than moderate misophonics and controls on all clinical traits and sensitivities that we measured, except interoception, and that moderate misophonics only differed from controls in terms of two subscales, the sensory hypersensitivity and autism spectrum attention to detail, and that it might be that sensory hypersensitivity is the core tendency of misophonia, but only the severe group develop clinically related tendencies. So then we conducted some more exploratory analyses. So this was the network analysis where we explore how the different measures are related. And it showed that sensory sensitivity as measured by the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire might be the central symptom uniting the other measures, and potentially it could be the causal trait of misophonia. So here, the network basically shows how the different subscales of the questionnaires are related. So here there's the Sussex Misophonia Scale, which actually measures the 5 factors of the experience of misophonia, such as pain, avoidance, repulsion, life consequences, intersocial reactivity, and feelings of isolation. So, and this seems to be most connected to the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire. And the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire also seems to be the kind of central trait connected to the others, to the other questionnaires. So it might be that this is essentially something that might underlie misophonia or drive misophonia. And most of the other questionnaires that kind of clustered together, subscales clustered together. For example, this is the Maya interoception questionnaire, but sometimes some of the subscales are related to other questionnaires as well. So for example, the not worrying aspect of interoception is negatively related to actually anxiety. So And then another type of exploratory analysis that we conducted was the phenomenological cartography, which is basically when we look at the auditory sensitivity task and look at how the different reactions to the different sounds can differentiate misophonics from controls. And so here, when misophonics are compared to controls, essentially all of these squares with the asterisk is the sounds and reactions that can differentiate misophonics from controls. It seems that most of these sounds that are most problematic for misophonics relative to controls are related to eating and these kinds of human-made sounds, such as crunching chips, apple crunch, chewing gum, sniffling, lip smacking, typing, pen clicking. So there's eating-related sounds, oral nasal sounds, and repetitive sounds. And then there's also particular reactions that really differentiate misophonics, such as body tension or rage. So basically, the conclusions from the exploratory analysis that misophonics and controls seem to be similar with regards to relative differences amongst sounds, or which sounds are ranked as least or worst, least problematic or worst. But misophonics give disproportionately high ratings to certain sounds, specifically human-made sounds and repetitive sounds. And then there's a constellation of features that are linked to misophonia reactions, such as annoyance, rage, anxiety, and body tension. And although there's particular, the phenomenological cartography showed that although there's particular sounds that kind of like have disproportionately higher ratings, it did show also that the majority of sounds kind of can differentiate people from misophonia from controls. So to summarize our findings so far, it seems that people with misophonia have a broad sensory sensitivity that extends beyond hearing and typical sound triggers. So it also involves visual stimuli, such as being more sensitive to the pattern glare stimuli, and also the self-report sensory hypersensitivity in the other modalities, such as olfaction and vision. And then we also did find that there are subgroups of misophonia where moderate misophonics tend to have heightened sensitivity, but the severe group also has elevated clinical traits such as anxiety, obsessive compulsive tendencies, and autism spectrum traits. And finally, human-made and repetitive sounds seem to be particularly problematic in misophonia. So then this raises the questions of where to go from this study and which aspects of the findings to investigate next. And there's various kind of ideas of where we might go next in terms of the next study. So one idea is exploring more these kinds of affective and physiological responses to misophonic triggers, but also potentially to other emotionally salient stimuli. So it might be the case that, as we show, people with misophonia just generally might have more anxiety and increased autonomic arousal. So perhaps they might have more kind of like intense emotional reactions to emotionally salient stimuli that may just involve misophonic triggers, or perhaps it also involves other stimuli as well that are threatening. And the other question is to look more into this sensory sensitivity from the neural basis perspective. So to explore this kind of like sensory sensitivity that goes across modalities in terms of what is the neural basis of this. It could be that there's certain characteristics that differentiate people with misophonia in terms of their resting state or task-based neural activity. For example, increased cortical excitability. So this kind of like more measuring sort of like the neural markers of misophonia, or the physiological markers of misophonia. But then also another question that comes from this research is, why is it specifically human-related sounds, and what exactly makes a sound misophonic? So why are human-made or repetitive sounds particularly problematic? And there's some previous research showing, not in people with misophonia, but just in general population, that there's sort of specific sound property-based characteristics that are unpleasant in sounds. So we started investigating this already, whether it may be the case that misophonic sounds essentially also tend to have these characteristics, and therefore they're kind of like unpleasant from a sensory point of view. But it might be also the case that there's some sort of higher level aspects that are at play. So misophonic people with misophonia tend to say that it's the intentionality of the source of sound that matters. So for example, if certain people make the sounds, they would get more aversive reactions than if the sounds were made, for example, by pets, because it sort of seems to be that they attribute this kind of intention that humans should not make those kinds of sounds, or they should be kind of like more mindful. And it's also the relationship to the person who makes the sound that seems to matter. So several people noted that it's specifically when people they know well makes these sounds that it might be more problematic, maybe because they kind of know that they have misophonia, so they should not do that. So there's kind of like more high-level belief-based or attribution-based aspects that could be explored. And it has already been shown that these kinds of beliefs and the affective responses in misophonia can be changed through cognitive behavioral therapy and other therapies based on acceptance and mindfulness. And then there's some other ideas that we recently had a panel meeting with misophonic participants, and they tended to point out these kinds of aspects, that it's the level of control over the sound that matters. So for example, if there's a situation where they cannot tell the person to stop making the sound, or if they cannot escape from the sound, then that might be more problematic. Or also having an expectation or anticipation of a trigger sound might influence the response. So for example, seeing a particular person, or they can kind of already see that they're going to cause these sounds, and then they might already kind of be tense and kind of experience that they will get triggered. And then another thing raised was that it might just be that it's just difficult to filter specific sounds out, or kind of like adapt to them, because they kind of always remain. And this might be another aspect of the sensory sensitivity, that these sounds cannot be easily filtered out or adapted to. And then there might be some other social relationship aspects, such as intentionality of the speaker, or whether they can kind of like ask the person to stop making these sounds. And then there's also kind of anxiety and more affective traits that we already discussed. So basically the take-home message from this was that we should perhaps continue to explore the sensory sensitivity and the affective traits and the sounds, and what makes a misophonic sound a trigger further. And another interesting thing from this meeting was participants noted that sometimes the sounds are more problematic if they cannot see the source of the sound. So they have to sit at the back so that they can kind of like see where the sound is coming from. So this might be something also related to perhaps expectation of the sound, or kind of like this multisensory aspect of the sound. So thank you for listening, and any questions or suggestions about the research are welcome. And I'd like to also thank you, the research team at the University of Sussex.
Thank you very much, Nora. That was fascinating stuff. Do we have any questions from the audience? I see some cameras coming on, Chris and Zoltan. Do you guys have questions? Or you just
I was just presenting my face rather than having a specific question.
Okay.
I could ask a question.
Okay, please do.
One thing you sort of hinted at is that it might be something social rather than low-level perceptual about it. Maybe a sort of rigidity about what is socially acceptable is what offends misophonics. So I was wondering, in some cultures, like in China, you're meant to eat noisily. Slurping and mouth open is a sign of enjoyment of your food, and is a positive thing. So have there been cross-cultural studies on this? Does it? I mean, does misophonia occur in China, for example, or does it occur for different sounds, maybe?
Yeah, I think actually there might be some research on that. I think I was looking at this, and I think there are cultural differences in terms of like what are sort of like the expectations around these kinds of human-made sounds, and it might be more problematic, sort of if there's kind of like strict expectations that kind of then get internalized. And I think also there's kind of like this sort of like expecting this aspect of like expecting perfection from others, or something like this, where it could be like essentially different things interacting. There's sensory sensitivity, and then there's also like expectations in terms of like which sounds should be appropriate, and they kind of like work together to create this response.
Yeah, thanks.
Sam, do you have a question?
I do. Can you hear me okay? Cool. Okay, great. Thank you for a really interesting talk, Nora. It's really, really cool stuff. I was wondering whether any of the analyses that you presented, maybe particularly the classifier analysis, can tell you whether the factors that you looked at, specific factors or some very specific combination of factors, are strictly necessary to be classified as having misophonia. So I guess you might not be able to infer causality, but it seems possible that you might be able to say, for instance, that participants who always score highly on both anxiety and obsessive compulsive traits may be misophonic, but even though as a group they tend to score highly on autism traits, that isn't strictly necessary to be classified with as having misophonia. So can you kind of establish, I don't know, some sort of like necessary or sufficient traits to be classified as misophonic?
That's a good question, and it's something that we probably can look into based on the data. Yeah, because it might be that, for example, like anxiety, for example, like obsessive compulsive tendencies, or maybe like autism spectrum traits might be sort of more kind of like relevant for causing misophonia, or it might be the anxiety sort of like, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really, I guess it might require a deep dive into the classifier analyses that you've done, like to really figure it out. But it's really cool, and an amazing data set as well. Huge numbers of people. Really cool stuff. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions from the chat. Charlotte is asking, such interesting data. Really enjoyed all of the different visualizations. For the neural mechanisms, I wonder if there's any role for myelination, as well as cortical excitability, or even underpinning excitability.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure, but I know that there might be studies kind of like showing that there might be aspects about like functional connectivity between regions that kind of like react to emotional salience, and I think auditory cortex. So it might be the case that there's something about the connectivity between certain regions that I think also regions that are kind of like representing interoceptive signals. I think the study, there's a study by Kumar and colleagues looking at how essentially misophonia might be a type of like hyper mirroring of other people's states. So it might be the case that sort of like when people hear these kind of like human-made body-related sounds, that they might kind of essentially hyper mirror them without really wanting to. And maybe that's why also they sometimes express that it feels that these sounds kind of like sometimes are sort of like intrusive. But I'm not sure about myelination, but it could be as well.
On the topic of cortical excitability, are you familiar with the work of Arnold Wilkins? He looks at visual stress and has theories about how it might be related to, you know, how like particular gratings drive the visual cortex and perhaps use more metabolic demands. So it's worth having a look into that if you haven't heard of that work. It might be related. I can see how it might be related to misophonia, and I think maybe Charlotte was alluding to that. Okay, so there's more questions. So Amber Tout is asking, that was great, thank you. I have a question about other types of misophonia, e.g., is there a misotactilia equivalent? My sister seems to have both of these and synaesthesia, and I'm wondering whether this is why they are generally more sensitive, i.e. because they have multiple types across senses that haven't been picked up on yet.
Okay. Yeah. There's a sense that haven't been picked up yet. Yeah, I think there is. I think there's misokinesia, or when you're kind of when you see certain movements. So for example, some people with misophonia also have the thing where if they see somebody making repetitive actions, or if they see, for example, people holding their utensils in a particular way, they would already kind of like have a misophonic aversive reaction. So it might be that there's these kinds of triggers are not specific to audition, but they're kind of like so they can be associated also with actions, or perhaps like with other modalities as well. So some people say that essentially misophonia could be thought of as a kind of like inducer concurrent, so synaesthesia in terms of sound and emotion, or sound and kind of like aversive reaction. So it could be that other stimuli as well, besides sound, could cause this kind of aversive reaction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can I just follow up quickly? She has an issue with like the feeling of fabric and stuff like that. She gets angry with the feeling of certain kind of materials and textures on her skin, which causes a problem with like, well, getting dressed and wearing certain clothes. So she also has this aversion to sound. And then on top of that is because she sees patterns in response to these sounds and texture feelings. I don't know whether she's got multiple things going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think this is something to be investigated further in terms of like this sensory sensitivity, because I think it's sort of like basically like an association that can be formed between like different kinds of stimuli. I think I guess depending on sensory sensitivity and the experiences one has.
Zoltan asks, is there such a thing as philophonia? I don't know what that first part of the word would mean. But, what is philo, Zoltan?
Philo is just the opposite of miso. A love of sounds.
I see.
It wasn't terribly serious, but I just wondered.
Oh, okay. It's actually kind of interesting, yeah, because there's this ASMR sort of phenomenon, which seems to be related to misophonia as well. So some people seek out these kinds of sounds that they find really relaxing. or they found they kind of have pleasant experience of listening to certain sounds, and they're also human related. So we're kind of like looking at how ASMR and misophonia might overlap as well, and they do overlap. So people who experience misophonia are more likely to experience ASMR as well. But it's kind of strange because in one condition it's sort of like an aversive reaction, but in ASMR it's a positive reaction. But yeah.
Well, thank you. Julia, do you have a question? Your hand keeps going up and down. I don't know if you're changing.
Yeah, I don't know. My computer is going crazy. Yeah, and also my video is not working. I'm sorry about it. I actually wanted to ask about asthma, because when you were explaining about misophonia, I kept thinking, well, this looks exactly like asthma, because they also react like positively to these repetitive human sounds, but they seem like, yeah, I was wondering if you just were thinking whether it could be the opposite end of a spectrum of emotional reactions of sounds, but just they appraise sounds more positively. So it's interesting that you just mentioned that they can co-occur, like misophonia and asthma. I thought they were opposite, not. So it's interesting. Like like people with misophonia, to some sounds they appraise them positively, but they have bad reactions to some sounds, like it's to some other sounds. So that's weird.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. I think there's one study showing that they're kind of related in a way, but I also think they're kind of very different just in terms of the experience, the misophonia and ASMR. But we're now conducting a study on these two and kind of how they relate to personality traits, because we're thinking that perhaps there might be some personality traits associated with misophonia that might mean people kind of like tend to react to these more negatively, and also like looking at what might differentiate them, and what personality traits also might unite them, because it might be that ASMR and misophonia are united sort of like by sensory sensitivity, but perhaps also different aspects of sensory sensitivity, because there's this aspect of hypersensitivity, and then there's this aspect of hyposensitivity, where people actually are less sensitive and they tend to seek out some strong stimuli, or they tend to like not notice when they're kind of cold or these kinds of things. So it might be that people on ASMR have more hyposensitivity or something like this. But yeah, in terms of why are they related, I am also not sure, but I think it might be something. I think there was a paper like showing that it might be something to do with like I think it's called like psychic boundaries, or sort of like how connected different kind of like regions are, so that how easily you can make these kinds of associations, or something like this.
Interesting. Thank you.
Jonathan is asking, could misophonia have any connection to the experience of chills when listening to music? Both have a kind of visceral, embodied, almost precognitive experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is related. I think it is related to ASMR and to that kind of experience as well, where we're sort of like, yeah, you have this kind of like embodied response to listening to certain kind of music. But I'm not entirely sure yet why is it the case that some people have these kinds of like more positive experiences, but other people have sort of more aversive, and what might they have in common? I think what they might have in common would be like sensory sensitivity, and perhaps this kind of concept of psychic boundaries, or how connected different regions are, but perhaps there's something that differentiates misophonia specifically in terms of the aversive reactions.
Okay, thank you. I think we will wrap up there. That was a fascinating talk, Nora. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming. Next week the talks are in person again, and it will be some project proposal talks from James Stone's group. So there's 2 talks next week. Thank you very much, everyone.